So sometimes you want to show some fallback or not found component if a certain unsupported path was entered, but in other cases, you might want to redirect the user. For example, in this application, if the user enters localhost 4200 slash nothing, I'm showing this text here. If the user enters slash users slash u3, I'm showing this component, but I'm not showing the tasks component fallback text, which I would get if I click on a user. So that fallback text here if a user has no tasks yet. So therefore here, for these routes, I actually want to set up another child route where the path is an empty string. So the path is therefore essentially the same as for the parent route. But here I then don't want to load some component, but instead I want to redirect the user to this child route. So put in other words, the default behavior for this user tasks component route should be that if no other path segment is added thereafter, the user gets redirected to the tasks child route. For that, we need this empty path, but then instead of specifying a component here, you should specify redirect to as a property. And that then allows you to specify the path to which you want to redirect. So in my case here, to tasks, so to this route. However, when specifying a redirect to, you should also add the path match property to tell Angular how this redirect path here should be parsed. You can set it to either prefix or full. And here I'll set it to prefix, and I'll get back to that in a second. With that set though, you will see that if you enter slash users slash u1, for example, and you hit enter, the tasks part is added automatically. So our redirect works. But what's this path match thing about now, and why do we set it to prefix? Well, here it wouldn't make a difference whether you set it to prefix or full. In both scenarios, you can enter your path, hit enter, and you would be taken there. But depending on your route configuration in other projects, it could make a difference. Because the difference is that with prefix, Angular takes a look at this path, combined with any parent route paths if available, and it checks if the URL that has been entered into the browser starts with this path. So this path combined with parent route paths, if the currently entered URL starts with that overall path. With full, on the other hand, it checks whether the entire entered path is equal to the path of this route. And you can see the difference if you change this main root route here. If instead of loading a component here, we decide to redirect, let's say to slash users slash u1, if that's what we want to do here, and we set path match to prefix, we'll have a problem. Because if we do that, we have possibly infinite redirects here, as this error tells us, because every route starts with nothing or with an empty string, if you want to put it like this. And with path match prefix, Angular would look at the beginning of the URL and see that every URL is met by this condition. Every URL starts with an empty string, if you want to look at it like this. So every route would trigger this redirect, and that would of course give us an infinite redirect loop. So here we would want full instead, so that there must not be anything after this empty string for this route to become active. So now really only your domain slash nothing would trigger this route and this redirect therefore. If I now save this error goes away, and if we don't enter anything here, we're redirected to slash users slash u1 and then to slash tasks because of that other redirect we set up earlier. So here it would make a difference. But here I'll go back to that no task component. I just wanted to show you the idea behind path match. Here it did not matter because we were dealing with a nested child route. And that's therefore how you can set up automatic redirects. Now at this point, the main route configuration for this demo application is done. We'll still explore more features throughout the rest of this section, but this is the number of routes I want to have in this application. Obviously, this is a relatively short list, and therefore having it all in one app routes TS file is absolutely fine. You could, however, consider outsourcing those child routes into a separate file to keep that main file a bit leaner and to get into this habit of keeping your overall project organized by working with multiple lean files. And therefore we could grab this children routes array here and then go to the users folder, for example. Though you could also argue that it's a tasks related feature, that's up to you. But here I'll go to the users folder and there I'll add a users.routes.ts file. The file name doesn't matter, but of course it follows this common convention of describing what's inside it. And in there we then want to export our routes constant, which should be of type routes, which is imported from Angular Router, which holds this routes configuration array. And of course, you now need to import any components that are referenced here into this file. Like this. Now back in the app routes TS file, you could and should import and use your user routes. So for that, I'll first of all get rid of these unused components, and then I'll import my routes from the users folder, and there this users routes file. And since I already have a constant named routes here, and we therefore would have a name clash, I'll give this an alias and name this user routes here in this import. And that then is the value I want to use for children. With that, we'll have exactly the same behavior as before. All these features will still work as before, as you can tell, but we're now splitting that code across multiple files. Again, not something you have to do, but something that can be useful for keeping your projects organized, something you might see in many Angular projects, and therefore something you should be aware of. So at this point, you already learned a lot about Angular's router and routing mechanism. And we will indeed also dive even deeper than that throughout the rest of this section. But first, I want to come back to this activated route object here, which you could inject into your components to get access to some information about the activated route, like the route parameters. And as you learned, this gives you an alternative to relying on Angular's input mechanism, where it can also provide route parameters as inputs, if enabled. You learned about this approach, and this activated route object indeed also provides some other information. You can, for example, also use it to extract information about query parameters or about data that might have been set or loaded up front, but I'll get back to that later. Instead, what I want to focus on here in this lecture is that this activated route object does not just have these properties that can be used to set up subscriptions, but instead you can also access a snapshot property on it. And that then gives you an object which seemingly has basically the same properties as the activated route, for example, a param map. But there is one super important difference between that snapshot and the activated route as a whole. Because if you log that snapshot here and you visit a user, you will see that it looks the same on first sight, but all the values you're dealing with here are now not subjects or observables, but instead actual values that you could use like this. For example, if you want to use the user ID parameter, you could get it from the param map or through the params object here, this nested params object. So you could get the user ID here by accessing activated route, snapshot, param map, and then get the user ID. Like we did it here, but now based on this snapshot. But the downside of this approach is now that this is now not a reactive object or anything like that. Instead, the user ID gets logged here, but as you now switch users, this log never gets updated. So this now is not re-executed as the component changes, because ng-on init isn't re-executed. That's why we set up a subscription earlier. But if you have a component where you know that it doesn't need to be re-executed, so if you have a use case that's different from the one we have in this demo app, then you could indeed use this snapshot to get quick and easy access to some route data like these parameters. But if you're on a component that indeed is reused as your route might change, you should instead rely on subscriptions like this or on Angular's input mechanism. But that's just also something to be aware of, because using this snapshot is also something you'll see in some projects.